Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and we live in a great city that we don't always think enough about. So our guest tonight is going to help us go through neighborhood by neighborhood, talk about some of the great neighborhoods in Chicago, and some of the famous people, mostly authors, who have come out of those neighborhoods and what those connections are. Our guest tonight is Richard Reeder. Mr. Reeder, thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure being here, Kevin.
So let's start with the basic concept of Chicago. It's a city of neighborhoods.
City of neighborhoods. Well, officially, the city of Chicago has 77 community areas. But
who decides what defines a
city
community
planners? City planners. The 77th additional neighborhood was a neighborhood, Edgewater. Okay, there were 76, and people that lived on the northern part of Uptown. They thought the neighborhood was pretty nice, and they didn't want it to get confused with some of the poor, blighted elements of Uptown. So they lobbied to get another neighborhood called Edgewater.
And who does one lobby to get a neighborhood
That was
designation?
the city of Chicago's Department of Planning.
And so the planning department says,
the
here
planning,
are these
yes.
77.
This is Edgewater, number 77.
And when did that happen?
That happened in the 60s.
Okay, it must have been connected at some point with the Edgewater Beach, formerly hotel,
Right.
apartments.
Right. Yeah, Edgewater was kind of an informal name for the area, and oftentimes neighborhoods are given their names by basically real estate interest. For instance, nowadays we hear about the neighborhood Wrigleyville in Chicago, but
is that, by the way, an officially sanctioned neighborhood?
No.
That's just a commercial designation.
Right. That's part of, basically it's part of Lakeview, okay, West Lakeview, but in order to make it kind of sexy and to maybe escalate real estate prices, they came up with Wrigleyville.
Now, weren't some of the neighborhoods actually named after towns, though? I mean, Chicago expanded and absorbed a lot of towns, like Rogers Park, for example.
Oh, sure.
Its own community before it became part of the city.
Right. Chicago was basically Chicago, the northern, until maybe the Columbian Exposition, the northern boundaries was basically Irving Park, which used to be called Graceland.
That was the name of the street?
Yeah, and there's Graceland Cemetery.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, and they got the name, which was bounded by Montrose and Irving Park. Yeah, and then Rogers Park and that uptown area, those were separate entities which were annexed into the city.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, they're their own towns with their own government structure.
Exactly.
In fact, Chicago has gone through a couple of fairly significant annexations throughout its history, has it not? It started very small. Geographic area.
Right. Yeah, so Chicago, that's why, like being out here in the western suburbs, you see all these cemeteries, and these were areas which were barren, and people could not be, after a certain time, people could not be buried within the city limits of Chicago. Graceland was, at one point, a part of the outside of the city. The exception was Lincoln Park, where there used to be a Civil War cemetery.
I've lived in Chicago all my life, and I never knew that.
In Lincoln Park, yes.
So what happened to it? It was moved?
They moved the bodies. A lot of those bodies were moved out to Oak Ridge Cemetery on the south side.
So what was the reason? There were no cemeteries allowed in the city? Was that what the health ordinance? What was the reason behind that?
You didn't want bodies
decaying
within the city boundaries, yes.
Interesting. So if the city Department of Planning decides what these official neighborhoods are, what constitutes a neighborhood?
Well, what constitutes a neighborhood? Chicago being a heavily immigrant city, a heavily Roman Catholic city, you can ask Catholic citizens, and often they would say the parish would define the neighborhood. You just go St. Barnabas, and
which parish are you from?
Which parish are you from? Right. So that's one part of definition. Institutions, more than I think anything else, the church, the synagogue in certain communities, they would define, this is the old Jewish neighborhoods of Lawndale and West Garfield Park would be, synagogues would be identifying factors. Community the Jewish Community Center, the Jewish People's Institute in Douglas Park, that used to define the neighborhood. It was a congregational place where people congregated.
Or I think actually in Rogers Park when I was growing up, Devon Avenue, which has been a great story of transition and immigration in Chicago. When I was young, it was largely Jewish merchants, and then it became when there was a Russian immigration wave, and many of the stores turned over were owned by Russians, and now it's owned by Pakistanis, by Indians, by other Middle Eastern, Middle Eastern heritages.
And your old neighborhood, Kevin, when you think about St. Ignatius Parish and Loyola University, those are defining institutions in Rogers Park. But then again, you have the old cultural institutions, the Granada Theater, the old Balaban and Katz movie theater.
Yes, the dearly departed Balaban and Katz.
The dearly departed, yes.
Right. In fact, as I drive through Rogers Park, I see that, of course, any neighborhood changes. But you look for all the old landmarks, and many of them now are gone. Well, Loyola University being such an economic power, they've taken over much of Rogers Park at this point. So I look and see things that used to be there, and it all says Loyola University.
And the old gym, remember, and I remember growing up in that neighborhood, or growing up in West Rogers Park. I was so excited about that 1963 Loyola University team that won the national championship.
Right, that was quite a feat. Yes, in fact, and I think of neighborhoods also. When I was young, the field house up on Sheridan Road at about Toohey, and it was a park district building. But there were, it had thinking of gyms, it had a really old, tiny, creaky floor, loose floorboard gymnasium there. But it was a great place to go, and that was part of the neighborhood as well.
That was on Greenleaf, on Loyola Fieldhouse. Yeah, and then you had Sam Leone, a little place where you could get canoes and kayaks.
Yes, indeed. I remember that well growing up. So how have the neighborhoods changed in Chicago's history? I mean, people move in, people move out, Rogers Park being an example. The demographic of the neighborhood has changed a lot. So what is it that maintains a character of a neighborhood? Or do we even have to think about that?
Well, there's buildings that have been around for 100 years in certain neighborhoods, but it's the people that transform a neighborhood. I think of the Humboldt Park community. Humboldt Park around North Avenue in California, North California and Kedzie. That neighborhood back in the 1920s and 1930s, it was a Jewish neighborhood. It was a combination Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian neighborhood. Sal Bello, the author, came from that neighborhood. And over the years, Humboldt Park was transformed mostly into a Latino neighborhood, heavily Puerto Rican, significant African-American community, other Latinos, Dominicans, Mexicans. And as Sal Bello used to be the literary voice of that neighborhood, talking about life, Jewish life in the 30s, Sandra Cisneros, a Chicago author who was Mexican but grew up in Humboldt Park and wrote a book called The House on Mango Street. So she wrote about her school experience and her parents. So at that time, this is a Latino community, but basically the homes, many of the churches are the same, but the people, the demographics changed.
And how far in time are those books separated?
Well, Bello writing, when he wrote about Humboldt Park in his great book, The Adventures of Augie March, that book was written in the early 50s. And Cisneros wrote The House on Mango Street in the 90s.
Right, so in 40 years, you have a significant turnover. But as you say, from the cultural perspective, you can look and the buildings are the same, the streets are the same, the street names are the same, but the culture has changed dramatically. Right.
And former synagogues, some of them have been converted into churches. You see that a lot on the old west side in Douglas Park, Garfield Park. Many Jewish synagogues are now African-American churches. Beautiful buildings, but now a synagogue to a church. You also see, that on the south side too.
So what do you think it says about neighborhoods if an author like Sal Bello or Ms. Cisneros, when they come out of these neighborhoods, what about the neighborhood creates their literature?
Oh boy, the sights, the sounds, the smells of a neighborhood create the literature, the friendships. Back in the 20s and 30s, there used to be social athletic clubs. For instance,
And were they really for socializing? And
they were socializing. In Bridgeport, there was a famous social athletic club called the Hamburgs, and Richard
yes.
J. Daley was a founding member. And you know, they did have a social and they had athletic purposes, just as they said. But the Hamburgs, in retrospect, in 1919, when there was a horrible race riot in the city of Chicago, there's documentation that some of the club members in Bridgeport and Canaryville of the Hamburgs participated in the race riot against African Americans, attacking African Americans in a virulent way.
Well, Chicago has a very mixed history when it comes to civil
Right.
rights. I mean, this was the place where Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. came and brought
Right.
the protests and the marches. And what I think was one of the most telling comments on that period, when then Mayor Richard J. Daley looked at it and said, "What's he talking? He don't even live here. What's he talking about?"
Right.
And I thought that was such a telling disconnection between Daley, who had grown up in Chicago,
Right.
and had this vision of the city and the way it worked, and looking at this outsider.
Yeah.
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
And really just couldn't comprehend that.
Yeah, and Chicago, Chicago has had the history of being a very segregated city. And what happened racially in Chicago was there was a line in Chicago, there was a racial line. At one time, that racial line would be, let's say, Halsted, okay? So African Americans could not move west of Halsted. So when we're talking about maybe the late 40s through the 70s, basically, the racial line, African Americans started moving, let's say, to Ashland. Then they started moving to Damon, Western, California, Kedzie. And there was a lot of resistance. So when Dr. King was in Chicago in the mid-60s, and places like Marquette Park, when he marched in Marquette Park, people saw this as the line.
They saw it as an invasion.
As an invasion. You know, when Dick Gregory led a protest in front of Richard J. Daley's home in Bridgeport at that time,
Right.
it was like, African Americans do not belong there. This is out of their neighborhood. They go on the other side of State Street. That's where African Americans belong.
Now, let's talk about that for a second, because although certainly racism was a key element in that, would there also have been the concept of neighborhoods when you said you're out of your neighborhood? Now, even if you take it back decades prior, the German Catholics didn't go to the Irish Catholic Church and vice versa.
Right.
Because you were out of your neighborhood.
Right.
And you just didn't go out of your neighborhood, regardless of what that neighborhood
Absolutely.
was. So, I mean, how much of this turmoil of the 60s may also have been rooted in that neighborhood concept?
Oh, very, very strong. I mean, I'm just thinking of a church in Old Town. I mean, the St. Michael's, which is Tony Old Town right now. That was a German church, and Poles couldn't go there.
Yes.
I mean, even though the Polish neighborhood was maybe about a mile away.
Right.
Okay,
you
north
just didn't do that.
on Division Street, yeah. The Poles would be limited to Saint Stanislaus or Saint Kacka or Holy Trinity, but not Saint Michael's. So within a Catholic community, there was
still
already
that kind of segregated neighborhood identity.
Absolutely.
And so is that part of what makes the neighborhood is some sort of identity of that neighborhood. Like, I am in this neighborhood, and that gives me something.
Right.
Something I can hold on to. Now, that's not nearly as strong now. I mean, I cannot imagine today that a Polish Catholic wouldn't be able to go to a German Catholic church or an Irish Catholic church,
Right.
or vice versa. So how much of that neighborhood identity still exists?
In Chicago, a lot of the neighborhood identity has moved to the suburbs. So let's say on the far south side, there used to be a very tight white community in neighborhoods like Roseland, okay, and Pullman. And those neighborhoods, those white families would go out to areas like Tinley Park and Orland Park. And a lot of the same related, friends and family members kind of moved southwest. You could even say that, let's say Italian neighborhoods in Chicago kind of moved west, so they would go what's basically along the Eisenhower, so you go into places like Lombard and Villa Park, and neighborhoods that used to be like Little Italy on the west side, they kind of moved west.
Melrose Park, very
Melrose
Italian.
Park,
Although
yeah.
now becoming very Hispanic.
Right. So there's just a lot of flux. Poles would go along north of Milwaukee Avenue, so the old Polish strong neighborhood, the Polish Triangle around Milwaukee, Ashland, and Division Street, well, that kind of moved north diagonally along Milwaukee Avenue, eventually into places like Niles, which became a heavily Polish community, or the northwest side.
And in fact, some of that still persists. About 6 or 8 months ago, I was at the Copernicus Center out in the northwest side of
Lawrence
Chicago.
Avenue.
And we pulled in the parking lot, and the attendant of the parking lot just spoke Polish to us,
Right.
assuming that if we're there, we must speak Polish. And I just thought, it struck me, I thought, boy, that's old Chicago. That's something you just don't see as much anymore. But there's just the assumption, this is where the Polish people hang out. You must speak Polish.
Right. And we have, Chicago is a huge Latino. I think the Mexican population in Metro Chicago now is something like 800,000. And in the city of Chicago, there are more Latino students now than African American students.
Really?
Yeah. Enrolled in the Chicago Public School System.
Well, I know that in the suburban schools, I live in the Proviso School District, and I know that there's been a tremendous demographic shift just in the few years I've been paying attention to it, and that is far more Hispanics. And it used to be almost exclusively African American with a small Hispanic population and a very small white and Asian. And now it's about 2/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic. And that change has happened just very quickly in a few years. So we see that kind of shift in the neighborhoods. And somehow the city, when I say the city, I include the suburbs, the metropolitan area, seems to survive just fine, despite this kind of roiling turnover of demographics.
Right. And the metro area, the population's been fairly stable. The city of Chicago has lost population significantly. Now Chicago.
You mean the city itself, or
the city? The city
within the city boundaries?
City itself.
Okay.
Chicago at one time, the second city. It was second in population. Then Los Angeles, surpassed it. Now Toronto in North America has actually surpassed Chicago. The city of Toronto has surpassed the city of Chicago. But the metro area of Chicago has actually shown a little bit of growth.
And it's about 8.5 million in the larger metropolitan areas.
Yeah, it depends. If you talk about the collar counties as well, it's approaching about 8 million.
Okay, so what are the future of neighborhoods? How do we see this evolving over time?
Well, unfortunately, there's some neighborhoods in the city that, because of the infrastructure, before the buildings are old, there are so many people that are out of work right now. Public housing in Chicago, the old vertical public housing, has been basically, a lot of that has been leveled. So you have certain communities, like on the south side between, let's say 35th Street and 51st, between State and Michigan, there used to be tens of thousands of people living in public housing, Stateway Gardens, Robert Taylor homes, Ida B. Wells. Those are leveled right now. So people wind up, so neighborhoods are pretty much leveled and destroyed, certain neighborhoods. And what you find are a lot of empty lots. Now you do have an emerging neighborhood called Bronzeville in that area, and that's trying to become gentrified. But
now, is Bronzeville officially sanctioned as a neighborhood? Or
Bronzeville is not officially sanctioned as a neighborhood.
Just another one of those marketing names, right?
Right.
Now, when I think about cities and changes, of course, the dark side of that is Detroit, and you think of Detroit and how they have lost more than 50% of their population from the peak. There are abandoned areas of the city.
Right.
And do we see that as being the fate of, is that unique to Detroit, or is that something that could happen to any city? Could Chicago face that fate?
I think with Chicago's always had a diverse economic base, and I think what happened was Detroit was, Detroit had cars.
Yeah, it was the auto industry.
It was the auto industry, and the car industry got diminished over the years. Foreign competition, less jobs. What existed with workers in the Detroit area, they could move out to the suburbs. So the city didn't have the kind of retail presence, manufacturing presence, and now the IT presence that Chicago has. So Chicago, I think, has a vibrant economy, which keeps its neighborhood stable.
Well, let's
let's
switch gears and talk a little bit about your book that's sitting here with this beautiful cover, Chicago Sketches. And as we were looking through it before the show, it really is a series of brief sketches of your experience with the city.
Yeah, it's basically, I was telling you about my early days in Lawndale, and I have some stories about my childhood. They're basically memoir vignettes, personal essays about people and places in my life. And many of them are connected to the neighborhoods that I've lived in, the neighborhoods that I've worked in. One of the jobs I had with the city was I used to be the administrator of the summer employment program that the city ran. And for a few years...
Well, before we get there, because I know where their story's going, I'd like you to just, because you talked about your friend who has done the illustrations, which I think are really spectacular. Here. So if you want to hold that up, we'll try to get a little close-up of the cover, which I think is really appealing. And then if you pick your favorite sketch out of there.
And Leonid Osseini is the illustrator. And, well, let's look at the cover sketch. This is basically from a story called Deli Man. And this is how a neighborhood kind of gets transformed. This sketch is about the Maxwell Street area. And Maxwell Street used to be the port of entry for Jewish immigrants, and there was a Maxwell Street market.
Sure, and immortalized by the Blues Brothers movies, among other cultural icons.
Yes, exactly. And there was, Maxwell Street, there was a deli called Lyons Deli. And Lyons Deli used to be on Maxwell and Halsted. And it was owned by the Lyons family. And it was, the Lyons family bought the restaurant in the 20s. And they had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, it was mostly Jewish clientele, but the neighborhood changed. And back in the 60s, there was a gentleman by the name of Nate Duncan, an African-American man, who was their counterman. And Nate eventually bought Lyons Deli. So,
and where is it today? Is Lyons Deli still around?
Yeah, the University of Illinois, through eminent domain, they tore it down. But this is kind of like the sketch of Deli Man, the Maxwell Street presence, the little silhouettes of kind of like klezmer musicians, in the background. But the story is Deli Man. It's kind of like that Jewish presence in the shadows.
And all of these are just really, as you say, that's sketches. So these aren't extended stories. They're not even short stories.
No, they're personal essays, and the stories are generally between 600 and 1,000 words.
So very short, just really kind of snapshots.
Snapshots, and again about people and places in Chicago, all set in the city of Chicago.
And I noticed that there is one about Riverview.
Ah, yes.
So Riverview, I think, and it's gone long enough now so that I think most Chicagoans.
You can see this one about Riverview.
There we go. Oh, yes, and then the spooky face.
Yeah.
Reminiscent of
and
a scary place.
Yeah, and I talk about. I graduated. I went to a high school called Mathra High School on the northwest side of Chicago, and our auditorium was small. So we graduated at Lane Tech High School, and Lane Tech High School was basically adjacent to Riverview. Yeah. And so after our high school graduation, we went to Riverview.
That was the class trip?
Yeah. And Riverview, nowadays, families go to Great America, and that's an amusement park. But Riverview is combination carnival and amusement park. So the
carnival in the old kind of scary sense.
Oh, the carnies.
Kind of unseemly characters who might hang out there. It wasn't always clear that it was really safe. That sort of had that kind of mystique to it.
Right. So it was a very unique place, and I talk a little bit about the kind of the sociology of Riverview too. because it was a place of fun, but it had a dark side as well.
Well, as a child, and I always used to give my mother a hard time about this. She had always promised to take us to Riverview every summer.
Uh-huh.
Every summer was going to be the trip to Riverview.
Yeah.
And then they tore it down. And we never got there. And my older brothers managed to make it on their own.
Yeah.
But, it was one of those places that was always on the list, and I never got there before it got torn down.
Right. And
For those very reasons. She would say it, but she didn't really want to go because it had that kind of mixed reputation.
Yeah. And I write about the Bohemian National Cemetery, where Mayor Cermak is buried. Mayor
Took a bullet for the
He
president.
took, well, so they say. So they say. Some people think that perhaps
It was aimed at him.
yeah, maybe some political people in Chicago, they didn't like him, and maybe it was intended for him. But anyway, these are wonderful stories. It's really an amazing city. It's a very vibrant city, and I try to capture that in this book.
So in your classes, I know you teach at Oakton Community College, and in your classes, what do you try to get your students to know about Chicago, and how do you try to get them to think about it and react to it and absorb it, make it better?
Well, just to find a little bit about the history and just to talk about the personalities. And Chicago's had a lot of interesting personalities, just literary personalities as well as political people. President Obama, I mean, he's
Yes,
a
he
wonderful.
wasn't born here.
Wasn't born here, but you talk about
Yeah.
the impact of Chicago.
And he has adopted this as his home city.
He has, and he.
In fact, I had cut you off on a story about that. I
Oh.
was leaving there. So, when you worked for the city,
When I worked for the city, it was the Mayor's Office of Employment and Training, and we funded a variety of community-based organizations. We throughout from the far south side to the far north side. And back in the 80s, we funded an organization in the Calumet Park area, which is south of Roseland. And we funded this organization. We had some funds available for a community organizer. And this community organizer
just happened to be a guy.
just happened to be a guy by the name of Barack Obama.
So you have your own personal connection, your own personal story about connected.
And he remembered me when I met him when he was
Years
running
later?
for the Senate. Okay, I met him a few times, and he remembered me. He said, "I remember you from a training session that I attended."
Yeah, well, and you were responsible in some sense for his being able to become what he is, because without the money to fund that position, who knows what position he might have taken.
Right. Yeah.
Life diverges amongst the various paths.
That's true. That's very true.
So we only have about a minute left. So what would you like our viewers tonight to see or hear or think or remember, most importantly, about neighborhoods and how they affect them?
Well, now that nice weather has come to Chicago,
Finally.
finally, my suggestion for people is to start going out and start seeing some neighborhoods.
And really take a look, right?
To take a look, not just the Loop, not just the Millennium Park area, but go to the south side. Jackson Park is a beautiful park. Humboldt Park. I know some people are concerned about security issues, but generally,
The middle of the day on a weekend.
the middle of the day on the weekend, it's a fine way to just start, getting a sense and trying to get out in the neighborhood, just to see what Chicago is all about.
I think there's no better way to sum up than that, to see
Okay.
what Chicago is all about.
Yes.
Richard, thank you so much for being
Okay.
here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.